There are many shows dedicated to Magic the Gathering strategies, decks, and formats. But unlike all of them, this channel is about discussing an individual card, an isolated card, an unrelated card. This is an Magic Card. Hello, my name is Dusty Cupboards, and welcome to episode 4 of An Magic Card. As always, we will begin by looking at some of the comments from the last video. Joseph Curran informed me that I couldn't possibly pronounce Cthulhu incorrectly because it can't be pronounced by the human tongue. Excellent. There is nothing better than succeeding in spite of your own complete lack of effort. Max of Lords gave an absolutely brilliant piece of insight into the endless usefulness of Geist-Fueled Scarecrow by pointing out that the Converge mechanic also benefits from self-taxing. Converge is an ability word which appeared on 13 cards from Battle for Zendikar and rewards you for using mana of many colors. So if you have a spell like Tajuru Stalwart, which Max of Lords specifically mentioned, which only costs 2 and a green mana, there is no way to use more than 3 colors of mana normally. However, if you have 2 Geist-Fueled Scarecrows on the battlefield, suddenly this Elf Scout ally can be cast for 4 generic mana and 1 green mana, meaning you can fit every color of the rainbow in there and cast it as an impressive 5/6 with no abilities. Max of Lords also mentions that these cards were both legal and standard at the same time, which means that if a long list of better cards had been banned from standard at the time, it's likely that this brutally efficient combo would have completely dominated the competitive scene. The Gliding Bulger says that they spotted Geist-Fueled Scarecrow in the bulk bin of their local game store and briefly contemplated collecting every card that I feature on this show. That's a great idea. I have yet to own a single card that I've talked about, but given their incredible affordability so far, I've thought about picking up some Banes and Zephyrnauts myself. When I get to some future milestone on this channel, perhaps a number of subscribers or views, I'll do a giveaway and send some lucky individual a copy of every card. Hopefully, I don't end up randomly selecting an incredibly expensive card, but based on my YouTube analytics, I should be a millionaire pretty soon, so no big deal, right? And now, without further ado, let's move on to our primary topic, one of the most beloved cards in the history of Magic. Back to the Gatherer. We've got the Geist-Fueled Scarecrow looking pretty over here on the left, and let's see who our next card is going to be. It is Plains. This is a really good looking Plains too. Portal 3 Kingdoms. Except that it won't be Plains because I explicitly said I'm not going to do basic lands. I feel like some people assume that I don't want to do Plains. I don't want to do a basic land because it would be too easy or the video would be too short. But the reality is that if I made a video about Plains, that video would easily be 3 or 4 hours long. Maybe for my 100th video I'll do Plains. All right, let's reroll. And we got, okay, whatever this is. Again, this is not a actual Magic card. So we're just gonna reroll again. It's cool though. It's a cool card, cool thing. Ah, okay. This is something. This is a Magic card. Overgrown Estate is a 3-mana rare enchantment from Apocalypse, the 23rd expert level expansion in the ongoing history of Richard Garfield's seminal trading card game, Magic the Gathering. Wow, look at this cool guy on the cover of the booster pack. I bet he's an important character in the story. Apocalypse is the 3rd set in the Invasion block, and like the 2nd set, Plane Shift, it is a small set, coming in at a mere 143 cards. From Tempest block until Mirrodin block, it was normal for smaller sets to be about this size, while the larger sets normally came in around 350 cards. It's also worth noting that in this time period, it was also common to refer to a trilogy of sets as a cycle rather than a block. So although throughout this video I shall be referring to the Invasion block, at the time it would have been more common to see it referred to as the Invasion cycle. You can see this term printed clearly on the books which accompanied the block. You probably think I'm not crazy enough to have read all 3 of these books just for the sake of making this stupid video. Surely there's no way I would waste countless hours of my life reading largely irrelevant fantasy fiction, which user Kim on Goodreads.com describes as a slog, right? Correct. I didn't read any of these books. I simply don't have time to read because I'm too busy programming JPEGs to spin around in After Effects. It's not much, but it's honest work. If I was going to take time to read the 930 pages contained within J. Robert King's Invasion Cycle trilogy, I would probably want to go back and start at the true beginning of the narrative, which encompasses 12 books and 3,978 pages of juicy, oblique Magepunk lore nuggets. Maybe someday when this series is done, and I've thoroughly inspected all unique Magic cards through my scientific process, I will hang up my hat, sit down in my rocking chair, tuck my long white beard into my pants, and think about doing that. The sets in the Invasion cycle were all codenamed after cities with Chinese names, because apparently the employees at Wizards of the Coast thought it was funny to choose codenames which were difficult to spell. Therefore, Invasion was Beijing, Planeshift was Hong Kong, and Apocalypse was Shanghai. It is worth pointing out that Hong Kong is not particularly difficult to spell, and also technically, it's a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China, and would more accurately be described as a region and not a city. I hope you enjoyed this information about the Invasion block codenames, because now this video is going to be blacklisted in China, which according to my YouTube analytics comprises up to 99% of my future viewers. Shanghai, also known as Apocalypse, released on Monday, June 4th, 2001. June 4th is the birthday of James Callis, who was very excellent on the 2004 version of Battlestar Galactica. He portrayed Gaius Baltar, a man of high esteem who became enamored with a woman of otherworldly origin who would eventually drive him mad and lead him to betray his own people. I wonder if that might have striking parallels to topics we discuss later in the video. And also the birthday of famous Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, about whom I shall say nothing more, out of fear that my videos will be blacklisted in yet another large authoritarian regime. The set symbol for Apocalypse is the Mask of Yawgmoth, who by all accounts is just some kind old doctor. Maybe there's more to his backstory, but I don't know and I haven't read the books about it. The most distinguishing feature of Invasion block is the great abundance of multicolored cards. Multicolored cards, or gold cards, as I stupidly called them when I was a child, were introduced in the set Legends. Being more than one color makes cards harder to cast, but in exchange it also generally allows them to access the proficiencies of multiple colors, which can make them quite potent. In Legends, they didn't really seem to understand this, and so all of the gold cards are bad, not good. By the time Invasion block rolled around though, the folks at Wizards of the Coast had a better handle on how to design well-balanced Magic cards. I had intended to put an image here showing an incredibly unbalanced Magic card from Invasion block, but it turns out that there really wasn't anything that bad. I'm not going to complain about fact or fiction. Out of the 143 cards in Apocalypse, a full 37 of them were gold or multicolored cards. That's more than 25%, and doesn't even include the many monocolored cards with off-color activations and split cards present in the set. Even though multicolored cards go back to Legends in 1994, and that set had some three-colored cards, like the Elder Dragons of Highlander fame, and the Goat Boys who accompanied them. Overgrown Estate is actually the first card ever printed with a mana cost that includes white, green, and black, a color combination which is most commonly referred to as Necra, although it is also sometimes occasionally known as Indatha or Junk. And in incredibly rare instances, people might infrequently use the esoteric term Abzan. If you don't play Magic the Gathering, you might not understand that this last section was a joke, because almost everybody refers to this color combination as Abzan. But again, if you don't play, I have no idea why you watch my videos. If you're bored, you could be reading 3,978 pages of somewhat acceptable fantasy fiction. Not only is Overgrown Estate the first Abzan card, the Wizards of the Coast wouldn't print another Abzan card until they daringly tread back into the realm of multicolored cards in Ravnica. In the third set of that block, they printed a card called Crime and Punishment, which was both a split card and a gold card. Technically, this card is an Abzan card, although technically it's also not an Abzan card. Technically, it's also not even called Crime and Punishment. It's called Crime. Punishment. The and is merely implied. The next true Abzan card to see print would be Teneb in Planar Chaos. This means that Overgrown Estate reigned supreme as the only real Abzan card
for more than 5 years.
More specifically, it was 5 years, 7 months, and 29 days from the time that Overgrown Estate was printed until another Abzan card was printed, which means that if you read 1.922 pages every day from the time that Overgrown Estate was released until another Abzan card was released, you would have just enough time to read all 12 of the novels that lead up to and include the Apocalypse novel. To this day, there are still only 20 Abzan cards, and only 7 cards that are cast for exactly 3 mana. And among those, only 3 of them are enchantments. And among those, only 1 of them is overgrown. If you look at the art for Death's Oasis, it clearly features vegetation, but it seems relatively unobtrusive. Overgrown Estate is card number 113 in Apocalypse, which is really hard to see on these old borders. It is found directly following Mystic Snake and directly preceding Pernicious Deed, 2 cards which are almost as well known as Overgrown Estate is. The old border gives the card a nostalgic look, with the centered text at the bottom and the tiger stripe style multicolor frame. Among Magic players, colloquially known as cardboard conjurers, there are many differing opinions over the aesthetics of card frames. I personally have a soft spot for the rippling gold satin texture of the old multicolor frame, but in general, I vastly prefer the mottled gold leaf texture present on newer multicolored cards. Overgrown Estate has never been reprinted, so we are only left to imagine what it might look like in the newer border, or what it could look look like in the weird future sight frame, or how it would look wearing wraparound sunglasses. It's unclear if we will ever see a reprint of this most ancient of Abzan cards, because it's hard to imagine a product where it would fit in. Overgrown Estate is an enchantment, which are clearly listed as the hardest card type to destroy on this chart I just created of how hard it is to destroy things. Being hard to destroy alone won't make a card worthwhile though. Sorry, Darksteel Relic. If you're going to include Overgrown Estate in your deck, you most likely are going to want to do one of two things: sacrifice your lands, or gain life. Gaining life is notorious among cardboard conjurers for being incredibly weak and undesirable. If we look back to the boon cycle from Alpha, the original Magic the Gathering set, the worst one by far is the one that gains you life. The rest of them are at least a little bit better. In most games of Magic, you lose when you get to 0 life, or when you get 10 infect counters, or when your opponent controls enough aligned Hedrons, or maybe you just get touched by a Goth Lady. Getting to 0 life is definitely the most common of those scenarios though, and so you might have a vested interest in staying above that number. Gaining life is a way to keep your vested interest number above null, but the problem is one of strategy. Not losing is not as good as winning, and no matter how much life you gain, you most likely don't win, unless you gain some arbitrarily high amount of life, functionally infinite life, and your opponent has no way of winning other than through damage. But to be clear, 3 life is considerably less than infinite life. The opposite side of this coin, or at least as far as Overgrown Estate is concerned, is that with lands, you usually want those to generate mana so that you can cast spells. In most instances, you would likely pay 3 life to prevent one of your lands from being destroyed. If somebody casts Cleansing, you are most definitely going to pay 1 life for each land. So, on an initial pass, it might seem like Overgrown Estate isn't very good, but judging the value of a card on first pass is often difficult, and perhaps there is a long list of incredibly unlikely situations where Overgrown Estate is in fact not useless, but instead slightly useful. Wouldn't that be incredibly on brand for this show? As with all Magic cards, and also all things in general, when looking at Overgrown Estate, we can find some similarities to other cards to help guide our brain thoughts. The first one of these cards, which many of us have likely brought into our brain thoughts, is the classic card Zuran Orb, a 0 mana artifact from Ice Age, and one of the many orbs from Magic's orb-filled history. Zuran Orb, especially with its modern rules text, has some very obvious parallels to our mossy Abzan mansion. You put your lands into the garbage, and you gain 2 health points. Obviously, Zuran Orb costs less because it's entirely free, but you only gain 2 life, and it's an artifact, which is easier to destroy, so there are clearly pros and cons in both columns. Another similar card is Dark Heart of the Woods, which is an enchantment that costs a black and a green mana. For those of you playing along at home, that is the same as Overgrown Estate, except without the white mana. Dark Heart of the Woods, or Tehotua, also gains you 3 life for trashing your lands, but only works with forests. You wanted to destroy all of your swamps to gain a small amount of life? Sorry buddy, not in these woods. It should also be noted this card was reprinted in Ravnica, where it has very orb-like art. Another card, which we can look at with our eyes, is Squandered Resources. It's another enchantment. This card also lets you sacrifice your lands, but instead of giving you precious life, it just gives you more mana, which is what lands give you in the first place. So this card is obviously pretty silly, and much worse than the other ones we've discussed. So why, and when, and where, and again why, would you want to play a 3 mana Abzan Zuran Orb enchantment? Well, to an extent, in the same places you might want to play a 0 mana artifact Zuran Orb, which is a lot of places, especially if the year is 1995 to 1997. Zuran Orb was banned in 1997, and prior to that it was restricted, back when being restricted was even a thing in Standard. Zuran Orb was played a lot. Maybe you were planning on destroying all of the lands in play anyways, with a card like Armageddon. There is simply no reason you wouldn't want to turn your lands into sweet, sweet life juice before doing so. Once all of those pesky lands are out of the way, you can start smashing your opponent in the face with one of your terrifying creatures. Eating your own lands also helps you to trigger cards like Land Tax, Oath of Lieges, and Weathered Wayfarer. Having less lands also allows your balance to really hit your opponents where it hurts. And if you have a Crucible of Worlds, or a Ramanop Excavator, or that big new Ramanop Excavator, whose name I can't recall, suddenly sacrificing lands isn't so bad for you. If you have a fast bond out, you can replay all of your lands for 1 life, which means you're coming out 1 life ahead with the Zorb, or 2 life ahead with the Estate. Now you're cooking with gas. If you want to play a deck which has more flavor, you can enchant your lands with Overgrowth before you sacrifice them to Overgrown Estate, which will just make sacrificing them much more costly, but in a thematic way, which your opponents will likely appreciate. If you decide to steal your opponent's lands and sacrifice them, they will probably appreciate that less. Herald of Leshrac is a card I greatly enjoy. Giltleaf Archdruid is a card which I would probably enjoy if my friend didn't use it to steal all of my lands on at least one occasion. The card Wellspring has a zebra on it. Some creatures get bigger the more lands are in your graveyard, and these too should be seen as an incentive to run our most lush manor. Knight of the Reliquary, Elvish Reclaimer, the new Multani, and Terravor, a Lurgoyf who loves to eat dirt so much he can't stop screaming. There are also a series of cards which return all lands to play, and I shall list a conveniently small number of them now. Planar Birth, Splendid Reclamation, the Mending of Dominaria. I'll talk more about Dominaria in a minute. World Shaper, and Scaretiller. Oh hey, look, it's a Scarecrow. Also, the Fall of the Thran, which both destroys all lands and returns them all to play. If there was one legendary creature that would most want to run Overgrown Estate in their commander decks, that would most likely be the Gitrog monster, followed closely by Lord Windgrace. I'll talk more about him in a minute. Titania, and Korvald. All of these legends synergize well with lands going into graveyards, and none of them have the right colors to play Overgrown Estate in their decks. Dark Heart of the Wood can be played in several of them, and because of that, it sees play in a whopping 52 decks. Unfortunately, our lonely old abode only sees play in a meager 23 decks. Who knows how many untold deck lists would eagerly embrace this musty old castle if it wasn't for an unfortunate misalignment of colors. So perhaps EDH just isn't the place for this flourishing residence of yore. But if somebody at Wizards of the Coast prints an Abzan legendary creature that lets you play lands from your graveyard and pay life for some kind of benefit, then expect your hundreds of copies of Overgrown Estate to suddenly jump up from its current price tag of 35 American cents to at least a $50, maybe $2.50. That's almost a whole dollar. If you did want to waste precious moments of your short life trying to construct a deck that would get the most out of the estate most overgrown, you would most likely want to include these 3 existing legendary creatures though. Crovax, and Crovax. I kind of wanted that to be like a big reveal moment, but obviously it says Crovax right on the card in the flavor text here, and you've been staring at this thing for like 10 minutes. So maybe that didn't really work out. It's Crovax's house though, in case you were confused. You can even see his name on the sign if you look closely. Crovax is a very neat character, and really epitomizes the paradigm for how Wizards of the Coast used to develop their stories. Like with card frames, there are certainly a good number of cardboard conjurers who will profusely attest that the story used to be way better in the old days. I don't think that this is strictly true, but I do think the overall narrative felt more grandiose when even the central characters had clear character arcs that would start and then ultimately finish. The modern story tends to have less arcs and more continuance. Crovax had one heck of an arc. Poor Crovax's life was kind of out of his hands, as he was born as part of an incredibly convoluted eugenics program and stalked all his life. Originally a noble from Urborg, an island on Dominaria, we can assume that Crovax grew up in this estate, and hopefully it wasn't quite as overgrown at the time. Urborg is perhaps now best known as being one big tomb for Yawgmoth, whose mask we talked about earlier. Remember him? Anyways, Urborg was also later home to Lord Windgrace, who was a big kitty cat man. I assume I showed a picture of him earlier. I'll have that same picture fly across the screen right now. I mentioned both of these things to establish a chronology. Before Urborg became a giant tomb, and before King from Tekken ruled the place, Urborg was a lovely little forested corner of Magic's largest and original world. This timeline leads some people to think that the Panther Man, Lord Windgrace, and our weary nobleman Crovax might share a surname, since throughout all of the multiple novels that feature the character of Crovax, his full name is never given. I would like to propose a different theory though, and it is one that is directly informed by the artwork present on Overgrown Estate. As already mentioned, the sign in front of the decrepit house says Crovax. It strikes me as odd to have your first name on a stone tablet outside your house. Therefore, I would postulate that Crovax is in fact the character's last name. Case closed. After leaving his home on the very pleasant island of Urborg, something Crovax and his literal guardian angel, Selenia, joined the protagonist-laden crew of the flying boat, the Weatherlight. I'm not going to name a single other member of the crew, because to do so would be opening a Pandora's box, which this video could never recover from. The key is that after leaving his home, his family is murdered to death by Phyrexian agents, Morinfen and Gallowbraid, who are characters insignificant enough that I feel comfortable mentioning them. The crew went to try and save Crovax's family, which could be a large extended family, but which I'm imagining as just a father and a mother and a sister who all look just like Crovax, but with slight differences. Unfortunately, they were too late to intervene. And then also Rofellos died for some reason, before Crovax remembered that he has a literal guardian angel, and she came and just kick the bees out of these Phyrexian agents. After the tragic death of his family, and also Raphello's, Krovax became increasingly obsessed with Selenia, who could not return his feelings. He thought that if he destroyed the magical artifact which bound her to his family, she might be free to fall in love with him, but instead, she was just free to go elsewhere. And that was something he did not handle well, which brings us to a pivotal question. Have you ever been so in love with an angel that it made you go crazy, and then you traveled to another plane of existence and killed that angel, and in doing so fulfilled an ancient curse which transformed you into a vampire, and then you became the ruler of that alternate plane of existence and led an invasion of your homeland? If you answered yes to even a fraction of those questions, you might be Krovax. And if that's the case, please leave a comment letting us know what your full name is. This traumatic series of unlikely events might sound terrible, but it should be noted that Krovax got 3 cards in the process, including one of these weird Vanguard cards. And in an alternate reality, he also got a card where he managed to break his curse, so at least hypothetically in one version of events, he didn't destroy everything he loved and become a tortured being of pure spite. This is now the point at which Krovax returns to his ancestral home. The condition we see depicted in the artwork for Overgrown Estate is the way in which the property looked when Krovax returned to it as a tyrannical invader. The illustration is quite nice, with subtle blending of green hues and many delightful ruinous details. The way the stonework on the facade is at times delineated with dark lines and alternately just implied with broad strokes. The dark roots present in the bottom left-hand corner, brought to the extreme foreground as a framing element. The way the building looms over us on an incline, backed by the brooding silhouettes of a dark and uninviting forest. The leaves, which are stippled generously over the base of the castle-like structure, help create a sense of unrestrained wilderness and long-neglected maintenance. The sky in the upper right-hand corner is clear and blue, but the dark shadows and dramatic dilapidation give the scene the ominous feeling of a moonlit night. The small armored figures in the bottom right-hand corner appear brutish, any sense of their humanity or beastly nature obscured completely by the overbearing visors of their thick metal armor. Large spikes visible on the left figure's pauldrons indicate clearly that this is likely a cruel oppressor, and the large axe wielded by the other figure resembles the weapon depicted in the statue of Krovax, which stands before the ancient dwelling. The piece is a clear diagonal composition, with our eye following the gesture of the armor-clad brute up the slope to the large archway which leads into the ruins. The dark background and foreground elements align with this band of focus to keep our attention in this narrow lane. The piece feels very much like a classic fantasy illustration, or even a more conventional landscape, but the barbarians in the corner, with lighter tones blocked on top of solid dark mass, are strongly reminiscent of famous pulp artists like Frank Frazetta. Brian Snoddy illustrated a great number of pieces, going all the way back to Alpha. Most of his work is done in gouache on Bristol board, and it would certainly seem like that's the case for Overgrown Estate. More than many artists, his style seems to differ pretty dramatically piece to piece, with a number of pieces seeming to resemble the understated pulp-inspired color blocking style seen in Overgrown Estate, while others have a more exaggerated comic book style. To a certain extent, these stylistic shifts seem to trace Snoddy's tenure as a magic artist, but unlike many artists, I don't know if I could confidently pick his pieces out of a lineup, regardless of era. Looking over his catalog, it is truly a joy to see him grow as an artist though. Outside of illustration, Brian also has a lot of other involvement in the gaming industry, but as far as cardboard conjuring is concerned, his contributions have decreased significantly in the last decade. Overgrown Estate lands squarely in the latter half of his career, and the quality of his work in these years is consistent and good. His penchant for simplified backgrounds and intense shadows serves him well. From looking at Overgrown Estate, one might initially have assumed that the building is unoccupied, but the mansion as depicted is likely either currently or recently the residence of the now villainous and heartless Krovax, Ascendant Evankar. Growing up, I never knew what the word Evankar meant, and maybe you still don't know what it means, but it's a completely made-up word, so don't feel bad. Evankar is the title given to the ruler of Wrath. It's worth noting that the card Ascendant Evankar is from a time when Magic would sometimes print cards representing specific characters, but not name them after that character, and sometimes also, those cards would not be legendary, despite depicting a single important character from the story. This version of Krovax is the one who took up residence in his ancestral home, and to just drive home how depraved he had become, upon regaining control of this overgrown estate, he had his family exhumed and then turned into puppets. Which sounds terrifying, but is also the plot to Weekend at Bernie's. For a character who was once so distraught by his family's death that he literally went insane, it shows that he has clearly completed his grieving process and learned to move on. Admittedly, he moved on to ruthless conquest and murder, but his emotional growth here shouldn't go underappreciated. The home where he grew up, saw his family slain, and experienced unrequited angel love should certainly be a place that brings up many feelings of remorse and pain. But Krovax has learned to bury the past and has made a new life for himself. He has learned to bury the land land he once called home and embrace life again. He has learned to sacrifice the land where he grew up to gain a newfound appreciation for life threefold. In his overgrown estate, he has learned to sacrifice lands to gain 3 life. And then he got stabbed in the chest by some guy who looks like Jonathan Frakes. Doesn't it suck that Raphaelis died? Alright, that brings us to the end of episode number 4. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know about all the obvious things I forgot to mention. 4 cards down, 20,430 cards to go on the next episode of In Magic.